George was a curious and energetic boy when his family moved to the new neighborhood. While his parents unpacked boxes and organized the house, he couldn't resist the temptation to explore the surroundings. With his brown eyes shining with excitement, George stepped out the back door, smelling freshly cut grass and hearing the birds singing. Walking through the backyard, he noticed a small trail leading to a grove behind the houses. Intrigued, George followed the path, his sneakers sinking slightly into the soft earth. After a few minutes, George arrived at a clearing where he saw something that made his heart leap. A small wooden fort, built between two sturdy trees. It was the kind of place he had always dreamed of having, a secret refuge away from adults. Excited, George ran towards the fort, barely able to contain his excitement. He was about to climb the rope ladder when he heard a shrill voice behind him. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" George turned around in surprise and saw a girl his age with curly hair and bright eyes. She had her hands on her hips and an indignant expression on her face. I was just looking," George stammered, feeling his cheeks turn red. "This is my fort," declared the girl firmly. "You can't just barge in like that." George felt a wave of shame and disappointment. "Sorry, I didn't know. I just moved here and was exploring." The girl's expression softened a bit. "Oh, you're the new neighbor. My mum mentioned that a family was moving into the house next door." George nodded, still feeling uncomfortable. "My name is George. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to invade your space." The girl studied him for a moment before smiling. "All right, I guess I overreacted a bit. My name is Elise. Want to take a look at the fort?" George's face lit up. "Really? Can I?" Elise laughed and gestured for him to follow her. "Of course, come on." The two climbed the rope ladder with George marveling at every detail of the fort. There were colourful cushions scattered across the wooden floor, drawings hanging on the walls, and even a small shelf with books and toys. "Wow, this is amazing!" exclaimed George, spinning around to take it all in. Elise smiled, proud. "Thank you. My dad helped me build it, but I decorated it all by myself." They spent the next few hours talking and playing in the fort. George told Elise about his old home and school, while she shared stories about the neighborhood and her favorite places to play. As the sun began to set, they climbed down from the fort, laughing and planning to meet again the next day. "I think we should head back home before our parents start to worry," said Elise. In the days and weeks that followed, George and Elise became inseparable. The fort in the forest turned into the headquarters of their adventures, where they spent hours inventing stories, drawing maps of imaginary treasures, and sharing secrets. The families of George and Elise also quickly grew close. Weekend barbecues became a tradition, with the children running around the yard while the adults chatted and laughed around the grill. Birthday parties were events eagerly anticipated by everyone, featuring elaborate decorations, fun games, and delicious cakes that made George and Elise's eyes sparkle with joy. As the years went by, the friendship between them only grew stronger. They faced the challenges of elementary school together, sharing snacks during recess and supporting each other in difficult classes. In the summers, they explored every corner of the neighborhood on their bicycles, creating memories they would cherish forever. When George and Elise were 13 years old, that was when George noticed that something began to change. He noticed that his heart beat faster when Elise smiled at him, and sometimes he found himself watching her for longer than usual. Her hair seemed to shine more under the sun, and the sound of her laughter made George feel a strange warmth in his chest. Confused by these new feelings, George didn't know how to act. He tried to behave normally, but sometimes found himself stammering or blushing when Elise was around. "Come on, George, why are you just standing there staring at me?" Elise often said, pulling him by the hand for yet another of their adventures. He would just smile shyly and follow her. Adolescence brought new challenges and experiences for both of them. George listened with a heavy heart when Elise, at 15, excitedly told him about her first kiss with a classmate. He forced a smile. George also had his own teenage passions, going on dates and experiencing the highs and lows of early relationships. He shared these experiences with Elise, who was always there to offer advice or a friendly shoulder. But as George approached 16, he could no longer deny that his feelings for Elise were different. It wasn't just a passing crush. It was something deeper, a love that had grown with them over the years. When Elise started dating a guy from school, George felt as if a weight had been placed on his chest. His father, ever observant, noticed the change in his son's behavior. One night, as George sat on the front porch, staring absent-mindedly at Elise's house, his father joined him. "Son, love is something mysterious," he said, placing a comforting hand on George's shoulder. "Be patient. If you truly love her, that feeling will remain, and if she loves you too, one day your paths will cross. Love always finds a way." George looked at his father, surprised by his wise words. He hadn't realized his feelings were so obvious. "How did you know?" George asked, feeling his cheeks grow warm. His father gently smiled. "A father always knows, George. And I saw how you looked at Elise since you were kids. But remember, true love also requires patience and respect. If it's meant to be, it will happen at the right time." The months passed and Elise's relationship came to an end. One day she asked to talk to George, and her heart raced at the possibility of finally having the chance to confess her feelings. They met at the old fort in the forest, now a little smaller than it seemed when they were children, but still full of cherished memories. "George, I broke up with Brian," Elise began, her eyes serious. "But that's not all. I got accepted into a university in another city." George's heart sank. "Another city? But that's great, Elise. Congratulations," he managed to say, forcing a smile. Elise smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Thank you. I'm really excited, but also scared. That's why I broke up with Brian. I'm focused on my studies, and I knew that dating could take my focus away from what I truly desire." George nodded, understanding that this was not the time to declare his feelings. Elise needed his support as a friend, not an emotional complication. "You are going to be amazing, Elise," he said sincerely. "I've always known you would go far." They spent the rest of the afternoon reminiscing about childhood memories and making plans for the future. When the sun began to set, they climbed down from the fort for the last time together. On the day of Elise's departure, George was there to say goodbye. Summer was at its peak, and the warm air vibrated with the buzzing of cicadas. Elise stood next to her parents' car, her bags already stored in the trunk. "So, I guess this is it," said Elise, her voice trembling slightly. George swallowed hard, fighting against the lump in his throat. "Yeah, I guess it is." They looked at each other for a moment, years of friendship and shared moments passing silently between them. Then, without warning, Elise threw herself into George's arms, hugging him tightly. "I'll miss you so much," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. George hugged her back, allowing himself for a brief moment to imagine a world where he could tell her how he felt. But he knew it wasn't the right time. "I'll miss you too," he replied softly. "But this isn't goodbye. It's just a see you later." Elise stepped back, wiping away a stubborn tear. "Promise you'll call and text me?" George smiled. "Every week, and I will be here whenever you come back to visit." With one last hug and a wave, Elise got into the car. George stood on the sidewalk watching the vehicle drive away until it disappeared around the corner of the street. The years that followed were an emotional roller coaster for George. He stayed in the city, attending the local college and keeping in regular contact with Elise. Every holiday, his heart raced with the anticipation of seeing her again. Elise always made it a point to spend time with George when she came home. They would meet at the old fort in the forest, now a bit worn by time. There, sitting on the wooden floor, they shared stories about their college lives, laughter, and sometimes tears. George never stopped seeing other girls during this time. He had a few relationships, some more serious than others, and allowed himself to experience love and passion. But deep in his heart, when he imagined his future, the woman he would spend the rest of his life with, it was always Elise's face that appeared in his mind. The years passed quickly, and before they knew it, Elise's graduation day arrived. George received the invitation with a mix of pride and anxiety. He thought that perhaps, finally, it was the right time to declare himself. On the day of the ceremony, George accompanied Elise's parents to the university. The campus was filled with smiling students in their gowns, proud families taking photos, and a general sense of accomplishment in the air. When he finally spotted Elise in the crowd, George felt his heart race. She was radiant, her smile brighter than ever. He began to walk towards her, the words he had long wanted to say poised on the tip of his tongue. But before he could reach her, a tall and handsome young man got there first. To George's shock, the young man picked Elise up by the waist and spun her around in the air, both laughing joyfully. When he put her down, they kissed. George's world seemed to slow down. He stood still, watching the scene unfold as if it were in a slow-motion movie. Elise was dating someone, and from the way they looked at each other, it seemed serious. With a heavy heart, George approached to greet Elise, forcing a smile. He congratulated her on her graduation and was politely introduced to her boyfriend. That night, as he drove back home, George made a painful decision. He needed to distance himself. He couldn't continue living for an unrequited love, waiting for a moment that might never come. In the months that followed, George dedicated himself intensely to work and new hobbies. He began traveling more, meeting new people, and exploring new interests. Although he still thought about Elise often, he was determined to move on. It was during this period that George met Sarah, a kind and intelligent woman. They began dating and, over time, developed a loving and comfortable relationship. George made an effort to fully give himself to this new love. Sarah was wonderful in every possible way, understanding, fun, and caring. He told himself that he had gotten over Elise, that he was ready for a new chapter in his life. After 2 years of dating, George decided to propose to Sarah. He planned a romantic dinner, bought a ring, and rehearsed his speech dozens of times. But when he finally asked the question, Sarah's answer took him completely by surprise. "Oh, George," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "I love you so much, but I can't marry you." Stunned, George could barely stammer a why. Sarah held his hands affectionately. "Because your heart was never entirely mine, George. There was always a part of you that belonged to someone else. I deserve to know that from the beginning." Sarah's words hit George like a punch in the stomach. He tried to deny it, but deep down he knew she was right. Despite all his efforts, he had never really gotten over Elise. In the months following the end of his relationship with Sarah, George felt lost. His parents had retired and moved to a coastal town, leaving him alone in the family home. He focused on his work, trying to fill the emptiness he felt. It was during this time that he received the devastating news. Elise's father had passed away. Without hesitation, George rushed to offer his support. When he arrived at Elise's family home, he found her sitting on the porch, her eyes red from crying so much. Without saying a word, George sat down next to her and enveloped her in a hug. Elise clung to him, sobbing on his shoulder. At that moment, all the barriers George had built up over the years crumbled. In the days that followed, George was constantly by Elise's side, helping with the funeral arrangements and offering silent comfort. He was also deeply grieving, as Elise's father had been like a second father to him. After the funeral, George and Elise spent more time together, reminiscing about happy memories and supporting each other in their shared grief. George discovered that Elise was no longer dating, having ended her relationship a few months earlier. One afternoon, while rummaging through old boxes of photos at Elise's mother's house, they came across a surprising image. It was a photo of Elise at just 1 year old, in the city park with her parents. But what caught their attention was what was in the background of the photo. George, also a baby, in the arms of his father. "I can't believe it," exclaimed Elise, her eyes wide with surprise. "George, look, it's us." George took the photo, examining it in amazement. It was incredible to think that their paths had crossed long before they became neighbours and best friends. "It's amazing," George murmured, still staring intently at the photo. Elise smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of nostalgia and something else that George couldn't decipher. "George, I think it was part of a bigger plan to bring our paths together. You've been a part of all my past memories." Elise's words stirred something in George. 20 years of love kept, of shared moments, of laughter and tears, all culminated in that instant. He knew it was now, or never. With his heart pounding, George set the photo aside and held Elise's hands. His eyes met hers, and he saw in them a reflection of his own feelings. "Yes, Elise, I have been part of your memories," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But Elise, I would also like to be part of your future." Time seemed to stop as Elise absorbed his words. For a dreadful moment, George feared he had made a mistake, ruined years of friendship with his confession. But then, slowly, a smile lit up Elise's face. Tears glistened in her eyes as she responded, "Oh, George, I have waited so long to hear you say that." With these words, she leaned forward and kissed him softly. It was a kiss full of promises, of years of unspoken love finally finding expression. When they parted, both were laughing and crying at the same time. George caressed Elise's face, scarcely believing that it was truly happening. "I've loved you for so long," he confessed, "but it never seemed like the right time to say it." Elise nodded, understanding. "Me too, George. I think it was always you from the very beginning. We just needed time to realize it." In the days and weeks that followed, George and Elise rediscovered each other, not just as childhood friends, but as soulmates who had finally found each other. They revisited all the special places of their youth, the fort in the forest, the city park, the ice cream shop where they used to go after school, each location now imbued with new meaning. As their relationship blossomed, George and Elise realized that their love was not just the result of a long friendship, but something deeper and more genuine. It was a love that had grown with them, matured over the years and through the experiences they had lived. Looking back, they understood that every moment of their lives, the joys, the sorrows, the challenges and the victories, had guided them to this point. The time that once seemed so frustrating to George now made sense. They needed that time to grow individually, to live their own experiences, to become the people they were destined to be. One night, George and Elise were talking about the future. Their fingers were intertwined, and there was a feeling of peace and contentment in the air. "You know," Elise said, looking at the stars, "sometimes I think about that picture of us as babies. It's almost as if the universe has been telling us something from the very beginning." George smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "Maybe it was. Maybe all of this, our friendship, the years of waiting, was necessary to bring us here." Elise turned to look at him, her eyes full of love. "I think you're right. And you know what? I wouldn't change a thing. Every moment brought us to here, and here is exactly where I want to be." George leaned in and kissed her softly. "Me too, Elise. Me too." As they embraced under the night sky, George and Elise knew that their story was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one they would write together. Their journey was a testament to the enduring power of true love, the beauty of friendship, and the idea that sometimes love finds its own way, in its own time, to unite two souls destined to be together. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 5 to show how much you liked it. Also, watch the video that is now appearing on your screen. See you soon.